Much for inviting me. Very happy to be here. And I'll just get this off my screen for a moment here. Here we go. Yeah, it's great to talk to a group with broad interests. And of course, as you know, I'm an economist. I'll try to be coherent and comprehensible and not use too much economics in what I do. I'm going to put some notes on the screen, but really these notes are just reminders to me about topics I want to be sure that I remember to cover. So if you don't want to look at your screen, you just want to close your eyes and listen to what I'm saying, that should work about equally well. Yeah, so as Alex mentioned, I've been at Simon Fraser University for a long time. Been about labor managed firms for roughly 40 years. I would describe myself roughly as an applied microeconomic theorist. I mean, what that tends to mean in practice is I tend to think about how to develop formal mathematical models of the behavior of labor managed firms. And I try to explain why labor managed firms are relatively rare compared to capitalist firms. I try to base my theoretical models on empirical evidence whenever possible. I don't just want to go off and speculate in my armchair. And I try to think about some policy implications. What could we do to enhance the population of labor managed firms? So Alex already did the advertising for the books, so I don't have to do too much of that. But as he mentioned, I have these two books governing the firm and the labor managed firm. Just sort of briefly on the difference between the two. The 2003 book has essentially no math. It's meant for a broad audience, including non-economists. So it does a range of things, talks about normative issues like democracy, equality, community, so forth, gives some case studies from a range of countries, talks about how economists view labor managed firms, but in a non-technical way, and has some policy ideas at the end. The 2018 book came out back in 2019, is aimed more at economists, and so I have to confess there's a bunch of math in that book. But I'd say out of 20 chapters, maybe 7 or so are purely verbal. So I mean, there's enough stuff in there that if you're not an economist or you don't like the formal modeling, I think you can skip over that and you'll still get the general idea of what's going on. And there also is a policy chapter at the end of that one. Okay, so just a little bit of terminology here. So when I use the term labor managed firm, and abbreviate that LMF, what I have in mind is any firm where ultimate control over the firm, over managerial decision-making, rests with labor suppliers. Now, if you want something more concrete than that, think about a workers' cooperative. The members of the workers' cooperative perhaps vote for people to be on a board of directors, and then the board of directors hires and fires the top management of the firm. That's kind of a concrete description of what I'm thinking about. But I also, when I say labor managed firm, I mean sometimes things a little broader than that. So for example, when I think about professional partnerships like law firms, accounting firms, medical clinics, things like this, these are often, in my view, organized as labor managed firms in the sense that you've got perhaps a subset of labor suppliers, the senior partners in a law firm, something like that. We're making managerial decisions. So I'm happy to include professional partnerships in my LMF category. When I use the term capital managed firm, I'll just abbreviate that KMF because economists like to use K for capital. I'm thinking about a firm where ultimate control over management rests with capital suppliers, and the sort of archetypal version of that is a corporation where you've got shareholders, the shareholders elect a board of directors hires and fires the managers. So there are other structures, of course, and various hybrid types of forms, employee stock ownership, co-determination, and so forth. So those kinds of hybrid forms might come up in the discussion later. I'm happy to talk about them. But for most of what I'm going to do, I'm just going to simplify and think of the world as being made up of there's KMFs and there's LMFs, and that's what we're going to think about. Okay, so empirical asymmetries. So what's interesting to me is that there are a number of important, interesting asymmetries between KMFs and LMFs in the real world. The most obvious one is that firms controlled by capital suppliers are pretty common. especially among large firms. Firms controlled by labor suppliers are relatively rare among, again, large firms. And so if you sort of look at an aggregate level about how much economic activity is accounted for in modern economies by things like workers' cooperatives, it tends to be small. It tends to max out at around 3 or 4% of total economic activity. You can measure it by sales, employment, assets. Doesn't really matter how you measure it. You're going to get something similar. Italy, among sort of countries in Europe and North America, probably has the highest percentage, maybe 3 or 4%. But many Western countries, the U.S., Canada, it might be 1% or less. If you throw in the professional, to increase the fraction a bit, but not by too much. So, so there's the big puzzle here, right? The big puzzle is, given that a lot of us think that control by the workforce is something that's attractive on grounds of democracy, equality, community. You can think about a variety of moral arguments in favor of that kind of an economic structure. Well, if they're so great, why are they so rare, right? And I think economists, and as well as other people who want to advocate for the merit of labor managed firms, need to have an answer to that question. And so it's one of the things that I've worked on in the course of my career is, how can you reconcile the seeming attractiveness of LMFs versus their relative rarity? I'm going to come back to that. I think that's the most important empirical asymmetry, but there are some others that are important. Economists have studied things like the distribution of KMFs and LMFs across different industries, differences in how they respond to economic shocks, which I'll come back to, differences in productivity levels, differences in survival rates. So the point being, there's a whole range of empirical ways in which these firms seem to not be identical. And so if we're looking for a good economic theory about labor managed firms, ideally what you'd like to account for is the entire range of asymmetries between KMFs and LMFs. And you'd like to do that, explain those asymmetries in a kind of systematic, coherent way. So that's been one of my goals in recent years. Okay, so a little bit of just intellectual history here. I don't want to spend too much time on this, but back when I was an assistant professor, which was in the early 80s, there was an established economic literature on labor managed firms, kind of had 3 main ideas. There were people who argued that labor managed firms maximize income per worker rather than profit. So, supposedly the capitalist firms go off and maximize profit, but the LMFs maximize this other thing that's a ratio. Some people argued LMFs have problems with investment and don't grow so rapidly. Some people argue that LMFs are rare because they have problems with work incentives and monitoring and of effort and things like that. I just want to say, all 3 of those ideas are now obsolete, right? So, we had kind of an ongoing argument within economics through the 80s and 90s and 2000s about whether these ideas had any merit or not. I think mainly for empirical reasons. At this point, these ideas are obsolete, and I think most serious people have kind of abandoned these things. I don't think it's really necessary for me to go into all of the details about why we've gotten rid of those ideas, but mostly we have. If you want a history about of economic thought about labor managed firms, I have an article on that, 2018, called The Theory of the Labor Managed Firm, Past, Present, and Future. Annals of Public and Cooperative Economics. So if you just want to know about the economic, the intellectual history of this in economics, take a look at that. Okay, so what would be a more modern view of how economists think about this thing? What we can do is we can start from a theoretical benchmark, which is, suppose we have a world of complete and competitive markets. Obviously we don't, but suppose we did. In such a world, suppose we did live in that world, economic theory makes a really powerful prediction. It predicts no asymmetries between KMFs and LMFs, right? So what would happen if you have complete competitive markets? Both types of firms are going to maximize profit, at least if you design them in a way that makes that possible. They maximize profit. They're going to be about equally common. They're going to be randomly distributed across industries. So here's the point. The point of that sort of abstract theoretical exercise is, if you want to explain the real asymmetries, the empirical asymmetries, you're going to have a theoretical framework that includes some market imperfections, right? Because we already know from theory, if we don't have the market imperfections, we can't explain the stuff that we're trying to explain, right? So we need to have a theory with market imperfections included. Well, that's fine. So economists have this standard list of potential market imperfections, things like externalities, public goods, information asymmetries, incomplete contracts, and so on. So there's no shortage of candidates for what kind of market imperfection we might want to think about. Then the question becomes, which of the things on that list are going to be most relevant for this comparison of LMFs and KMFs? Okay, so I'm going to come back to all of that too. Well, let me just say, market imperfections are kind of a necessary condition for thinking about this problem, but they're not a sufficient condition, and here's why. You also have to identify some difference between capital and labor. There has to be some qualitative difference of some kind so that it matters whether firms are controlled by capital suppliers or labor suppliers. If you didn't identify some kind of a difference between capital and labor, then yeah, you could have market imperfections, whatever they are, public goods, informational problems, whatever. But those market imperfections are going to have symmetric effects on the two kinds of firms, right? So until you sort of identify that, you know, capital has certain characteristics that labor doesn't have, or vice versa, then you're just going to get symmetric effects from market imperfections. So here's my suggestion, and this is an argument that I push pretty hard in this 2018 book. I would argue the big difference is that capital is alienable, labor is inalienable, and I'll just explain what I mean by that. For non-human assets, what we normally think of as capital, things like machines, buildings, patents, land, all that kind of stuff, ownership is really easy to transfer among individuals or across groups, right? So there's really no problem taking a building or a machine and having one person or one group sell it to another. You can do that. But for human assets, what you might think of as human capital, so things like time, talents, knowledge, experience, those kinds of things, it's simply not possible to transfer ownership of those kinds of assets from one person to another. I mean, the best you can do is maybe, you know, I've got some human capital about economics. I could teach a course in economics. I could try to explain economics to my students. That's a very slow and difficult way of transferring things like skills and knowledge to other people. But you can't do it through a simple ownership exchange. And what I argue is that that difference has a lot of economic implications. I won't go through the whole list, but for example, there's no problem having firms own non-human assets like machines. Firms can collectively own those kinds of things, but they can't own human assets. Human assets are owned by the persons involved. And so firms can really only get labor by sort of renting human capital. They can't own human capital. So what I try to do in this 2018 book, I try to show how, on the one hand, you take market imperfections. On the other hand, you take the alienability difference between capital and labor, and you put those two things together, and I try to show that they interact in ways that help to explain these real-world asymmetries that we observe in capitalist firms and labor-managed firms. So that's kind of what that book is about. Okay. So let me switch gears and put the theory to one side. What do we know empirically? I mean, as economists, what do we know about the behavior of labor managed firms? We actually know a lot. There's been some quite good econometric research done on labor managed firms over the last 2 decades or so. The best data sources tend to be from Italy, Spain, France, Uruguay. And so, you know, let me just give you a short list of things that I'm pretty confident we know at this point. And you can look at the book if you want more citations. So we do have a bunch of countries and a bunch of industries where capitalist firms and labor managed firms compete against each other in the same industry. Those kinds of comparisons are really useful. When they do compete in the same industry, there's quite a nice study of comparative productivity for France. And labor managed firms appear to have productivity levels that are at least as high, sometimes higher than capitalist firms. It depends on the industry, right? So sometimes in some industries, you find no statistically significant difference, okay? In other industries, you find that labor managed firms have higher productivity in the sense that if the capitalist firms could imitate the production technology of the LMFs, the capitalist firms would do better. But there's something presumably that's preventing them from using the same techniques, same technology as the LMFs. When they compete in the same industry, again, labor managed firms appear to have survival rates that seem to be at least as good, sometimes higher than KMFs. Again, depends on the industry. Some industries, no statistically significant difference. Other industries seem to be quite significant differences, particularly in service sector industries. LMFs seem to do well. This is based on data from Uruguay. But people have found, I mean, that's where the best data is coming from on this, but people find similar things for other countries. A third thing, how do labor managed firms respond to economic shocks? And what I mean by that is shifts in demand, shifts in cost, that kind of thing. What they tend to do, and I think this is very well established at this point, labor managed firms tend to keep employment more stable than what a conventional capitalist firm would do. And in exchange, what the trade-off is the LMFs have to accept larger fluctuations of the income in the incomes of individual workers, okay, compared to what you see in KMF. So it's kind of a trade-off between employment stability versus income fluctuation, and the LMFs are clearly different from the KMFs on that. Been some research on what kinds of industries LMFs are more likely to enter and less likely to enter. This is from the UK manufacturing. Some people have found that LMFs are less likely to enter industries that are more capital intensive. It's not a big surprise, we'll come back to that, or have more risk. So there seems to be some risk aversion among LMFs in the industries that they choose. And another thing that I find really interesting, just kind of wrap up with this, is new LMFs seem to be more likely to emerge in regions, industries, large population of LMFs already exists. So this is based on evidence from Spain, from the Basque Country in Spain. So there seem to be positive agglomeration effects. If you can somehow get a group of labor managed firms in a particular geographic area, particular industry, then that makes it easier to form the next one. It makes it easier for the next one to enter. Now, for all of these, I just want to throw out a caveat. Some of this stuff is based on, good, high quality econometric research, good data, but we need replications of these things. We need to study these things in additional countries, additional time periods, and so on. But I feel fairly confident about that list of facts that I'm giving. Okay, so now let's go back to this thing about why are labor managed firms rare, and see if we can make some progress on that. First of all, I find it really useful just to think about this in a demographic sort of way. So we've got a population of LMFs out there. You can think about a particular country, if you like. So a given country has some population of these firms. Well, what determines the size of that population? And I think there's essentially four things that we want to be focused on. There's a birth rate issue, right? How often are LMFs created? Well, that's the birth rate. How often are capitalist firms converted into LMFs, right? Well, that's a separate question. So the birth rate question is just creation from scratch. I mean, if you're starting from nothing, do you create an LMF? The second question, though, is you've got an existing firm, it's a capitalist firm. How often do those capitalist firms get converted into labor managed firms through some kind of employee buyout or something like that? That's also important. You've got the converse rate, the rate at which the labor managed firms are being converted into KMFs. And of course, if you're losing lots of LMFs through conversion into KMFs, that's going to depress your population of LMFs. And then the final thing is, what's the LMF death rate? I mean, how often do they fail? How often do they just go out of business? And so on. Okay, here's my reading of the evidence on this stuff. I think the evidence indicates, going back to some of what I was talking earlier about with survival, once LMFs exist, they seem to have pretty high survival rates. Doesn't seem to be a big problem there. The productivity evidence seems to be consistent with that. An economist would think that, other things being equal, firms with higher productivity have a better chance of survival. So those things line up. So I would say the problem is not a high death rate compared to KMFs. conditional on being created, LMFs seem to do pretty well. So that's not the problem. Now, what about the second thing, which is the rate at which KMFs get converted into LMF? Well, actually, let me go to the third thing. How many LMFs do we lose through conversion into KMFs? There are examples of that. For example, in the US, there's this long history of plywood cooperatives in the northwestern part of the US. Some of those plywood cooperatives were converted into KMFs through members selling out to outside investors, and so on. Not all of them did, but some did. So you can find examples like that. In Europe, my sense is this is not a big deal. And I think the reason it's not is that most European worker cooperatives have institutional rules that tend to make it very difficult or impossible to take an LMF and convert it into a KMF. So I don't think the problem is mainly that LMFs are kind of routinely converted into KMFs once they've been created. So, okay, so we've knocked out 2 of the 4 factors here. I think the remaining 2 factors are both very important. So on the LMF birth rate, it is vastly lower than the KMF birth rate. There's just no question. For countries where we have good data on an annual basis, you get something like somewhere between 100 and 1,000 times as many KMFs being created every year compared to LMFs. So this is clearly a crucial part of the story. There's some reason why LMFs are not being created anywhere near as often as KMFs. We need to understand that. We need to know why that's true. The other thing that's clear is that there are, I'd say very few in my notes, relatively few KMFs being converted into LMFs through employee buyouts. That does sometimes happen. It's usually in cases where the capitalist firm has gotten into financial trouble. You've got workers who are trying to preserve jobs. Maybe it helps if you have a union, and the union can help to negotiate the employee buyout. So, you know, that happens, but it doesn't happen very often for firms that are not in financial distress, right? So for your average run-of-the-mill capitalist firm that's financially not in any particular trouble, very, very rarely converted into LMFs. So, and that's interesting because given there's an enormous population of capitalist firms out there, even a small increase in conversion rate would increase the LMF population by quite a bit. Okay, so that's kind of my demographic way of thinking. So let me just then go to an economic way of thinking. So as I said, I think the evidence is once they exist, LMFs perform well in many industries. They've been able to thrive in Italy, France, Spain, other places. But you know, even there, they're kind of a small part of the overall economy. So what are the barriers to entry for LMFs created from scratch? Well, there's a couple of traditional arguments on this among economists, which you know won't be surprising to anybody. The first thing that people normally point to is access to capital. Maybe labor managed firms have trouble getting their hands on the capital they need to create firms. That would obviously be more a problem for capital intensive industries, less of a problem for labor intensive industries, but nevertheless. Second traditional argument, workers are risk averse. They want financial diversification, and that would make them reluctant to create labor managed firms in sort of high risk industries that have a lot of volatility and profit and so on. Now, I don't disagree with either of those things. I think they're both probably important. There's at least a little bit of empirical evidence for both of those things. Let me just mention, this is not something that non-economists might care a lot about, but there's multiple reasons why LMFs could have problems with access to capital. There's some standard kind of informational asymmetry arguments that sort of go under the heading of adverse selection and moral hazard, things like that. That might be part of the story. But there could also be other reasons. And one reason might be difficulties that LMFs might face in making credible commitments that they're actually going to repay outside investors, right? So if you imagine, for example, that you're going to sell equity shares to outside investors and that's how you're going to get capital, but the outside investors don't get any voting rights because it has to be an LMF, they might be a little concerned about whether they're ultimately going to get paid anything in terms of dividends or whatever. So there are those kinds of sort of incentive and commitment issues. I would make a third point, and I think this point is really sort of underplayed, underestimated, at least in the economics literature. I don't know about elsewhere, but I think imagine that you've got an entrepreneur. An entrepreneur has a project, thinking about creating a firm. Workers in general are not always going to know whether the project being proposed by an entrepreneur is actually, a good project or a bad project. It's going to be valuable or not. That lack of information, that incompleteness of information about the quality of the project, is going to make workers less willing to pay for membership rights in labor managed firms, right? Because there's an adverse selection problem, right? You might say, well, if it turns out to be a great project, wonderful, I'll be happy that I paid to become a member. But if it turns out to be a bad project, I'm going to be extremely unhappy that I paid anything to become a member. And so in general, this tends to depress the average amount of money that workers are willing to pay to join LMFs. Well, from an entrepreneur's point of view, even if you know you've got a good project, because of this adverse selection problem, you say, well, the workers aren't willing to pay very much to join an LMF. So I don't really have any other way of extracting rent or extracting profit from creating an LMF other than selling membership rights. So I'm going to create a KMF instead. And I do have ways of extracting entrepreneurial rents from that. And that could be true even if the LMF would have had higher productivity. So I think there's this informational problem right up front that workers don't necessarily know very much about the projects being proposed. I actually think there's an empirical case of this that I find pretty persuasive, which has to do with the plywood cooperatives in the US Northwest, where there were some scandals in the 1950s involving creation of firms that actually had no value, and people went to prison and so forth. And that really shut down the creation of new labor managed firms in that industry. Anyway, so I'll just throw that out there as another thing. Okay, what about barriers to conversion of existing capitalist firms into LMFs? Again, if you're talking about financially successful KMFs, well, you got to have some capital to buy a successful firm. That might be a problem. Risk attitudes might, again, be a problem. Diversification, so forth. But I would add several other things to that list. So I think imperfect worker knowledge about the firm, again, is important in a slightly different way. Workers might ask, well, what's going to be the value of this firm if we convert it from a KMF to an LMF? For example, is the size of how big are the productivity gains that are going to result from conversion? We might think that possibly there are going to be some productivity gains. We've got a lot of uncertainty about how big those gains might be. You can't rely on the existing managers or the existing owners to give you reliable information about that. So you're going to have to find some way of getting information. A second point is free rider problems, that when someone is organizing employee buyouts, the costs of doing that in terms of time, money, research, and effort, and so forth, those costs tend to be concentrated on individuals or small groups. But if the employee buyout succeeds, then the benefits get spread very broadly over the entire workforce. So, there are free rider issues there. Unions, I think, can help with those problems a bit, but it's still probably a significant issue. And then the last thing is just heterogeneity among workers themselves. I mean, workers don't all have the same attitudes about risk. They don't all have the same attitudes about consumption today versus saving and consuming tomorrow. They don't all have the same preferences about working conditions versus income and what kind of trade-offs they're willing to make. So my general point on that is just that workers' control is a public good from the standpoint of the individual workers in the firm. And just as with any other public good, individuals may differ in their willingness to pay for it. And so if you're thinking about workers as potentially taxing themselves in some way, maybe through payroll deductions or something to try to finance a buyout of a capitalist firm, different workers are going to have different willingness to pay on that sort of thing. Okay, so a few policy ideas. Then we'll go to a discussion. So if I'm right about the general picture that I'm painting here, that's an if, then what you want to do is increase the population of labor managed firms in the world. I think there's two main things to think about. The first is on this conversion point. We want to have some way of facilitating the conversion of capitalist firms into labor managed firms, probably through gradual worker accumulation of equity shares over time. We can think about subsidy mechanisms. I'm not suggesting that workers have to pay for this entirely on their own. Governments can subsidize this process. So for example, in the US, we have employee stock ownership plans, and there are tax subsidies for those plans. But I think what you would need is some rules ensuring that the outcome of this accumulation of equity shares by employees is actually going to be full workers' control with one vote per worker, which is not necessarily what you're going to get out of an employee stock ownership plan. Okay, so that's one general strategy. I think another general strategy is forming federations of labor managed firms. And I'm thinking about, for example, the Mondragon Group in Spain. I'm thinking about the Lega in Italy and some other federations where you have central agencies in the federation that can supply capital for creating new labor managed firms and also for conversion of existing capitalist firms. And these federations have a number of advantages, not just in terms of capital supply, but they help deal with risk problems. They can spread risk around multiple firms, provide technical support, help to deal with some of these informational asymmetry problems that I've been mentioning, and some of these credible commitment problems as well. I would argue that you're normally going to need some government involvement in creating these federations. The ones that we have kind of emerged through a bunch of, historically contingent political sorts of processes. But I think if you're serious about doing this in a systematic way, pretty clear that number one, market failures are relevant, so there is some justification for subsidies, and normally you're going to have some public sector role with financing. Let's see. Okay, just a few closing comments then. I think if you look at differences in the size of labor managed firm sector or worker cooperative sector across different countries, it suggests to me that institutions are important, history is important, politics is important, institutions are important. Those are probably the things that account for the fact that places like Italy, France, Spain have relatively robust sectors of labor managed firms, whereas other countries may have very much less robust sectors. So some evidence that institutions are important to all of this. I think we got to be careful about institutional design. There are a bunch of problems out there that I think we as economists, we kind of learn about. And I mentioned free rider problems, informational problems, commitment problems, and so on. So you got to be careful how you design institutions, make sure you're not vulnerable too much to those kinds of things. I think experience indicates that LMFs have certain kinds of predictable problems and they need certain kinds of rules to avoid those problems. For example, I'd be in favor of rules that limit the use of non-member labor, because I think there's kind of a systematic temptation to do that. Rules mandating sort of minimum rates of reinvestment, and preventing sales of labor managed firms to outside investors. And there are also issues about entry and exit of workers from LMFs, from co-ops. So there need to be some rules about when new people are entering the firm, what kind of membership fees are they paying? When people are leaving the firm, is the firm repurchasing their membership rights? If so, at what price? Does the price reflect the present value of future membership? So these kinds of things are important for getting investment incentives right. We need to target resources on industries where LMFs are most likely to have productivity advantages. My guess is that that's going to, historically, I think it's involved relatively labor intensive industries, industries where there's relatively low risk, industries where production technologies are relatively well understood and so forth. But I think we need a lot more empirical research to sort of identify the characteristics of industries where LMFs have productivity advantages. I think the service sector appears to be pretty important for that. We might need to focus resources geographically because there seem to be these agglomeration effects. So if you can get a bunch of LMFs going in a particular geographic area, that might be, some targeting of that kind might be a good idea. So I talk more about these kinds of policy issues in the last chapters of my two books, the 2003 and the 2018. So if you want to see more on that, you can look there. So maybe I'll stop sharing at this point and we can just start talking. Okay, I ran over a little bit, but hopefully not too much. So Alex, you want to run the show?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for the talk. It was very interesting. So yeah, I think we can just start the Q&A session right away and just raise your hand virtually or wave to me or I don't know, do something. So I got Hannes first on the list.
This was actually just meant to clap my hands, but I do have a question also. Maybe I'll start with, yeah, thanks a lot for your talk, and I really benefited a lot from your books and also from your talk now, of course. There's a very basic question at the beginning when you define LMF as having ultimate control over management. That's fine for me, but there are like two diverging avenues how you could get that. I think you had in mind the cooperative, like the Mondragon cooperative, where all the, like ideally, all the workers, all the employees also own the firm, and all the owners of the firm also work in the firm. So there's this 100% identity between ownership and work and control. But you could also go this really in this other direction, where you have control over the management by the workers, but 100% external financing of the firm. I mean, you mentioned this also. You mentioned this problems that then come in, like how do the investors, the outside investors, get a credible commitment by the employees to pay out dividends and pay back the shares or whatever. But at least in this case where you have 100% outside investors, like a lot of problems would just disappear. You know, all these problems, how you deal with risk aversion of workers, how you get enough capital to supply for cooperative, it would just disappear because the financing would come from the outside. I mean, I'm not really convinced of that perspective, but at least I think for many theorists of firm democracy, it's a very tempting perspective, because you get rid of a lot of problems kind of immediately.
Sure. Yeah. No. I mean, good point. And I think there are a variety of ways where you might think about dealing with capital supply problems or dealing with risk problems through essentially market-like relationships with outside people, right? So, so on the capital supply side, I could imagine doing that in several ways. Actually, I mean, you could just have pure rental of physical assets. I mean, if what you need is a machine, you go out and rent a machine, right? And so, and many conventional capitalist firms, lease equipment, they lease buildings, they trucks, they, you know, all these things, right? So on some level, you might think just simply leasing physical assets is something that labor managed firms could do. Apart from leasing, then I guess the next thing I would think about is debt, right? Borrowing, right? So you can go out to a capital market where there are lenders and you borrow some money and you use the money to buy the assets you need, and you have some contract about paying money back with interest and so on. Yeah, so that's a thing. Another thing you could then do is think about the sort of, you know, equity investor thing, but without voting rights, which I mentioned. You know, and you could take that, you know, a step further, right? You could say, okay, well, now you've solved your capital supply problem. Why not solve your risk problems in the same way, right? Why not have outside insurance companies, right? And so, you know, if I want to, if I'm a worker and I'm worried about risk to my income and in my co-op, well, that's fine. Our co-op can just go out and sign a contract with an insurance company. If income is low, they'll pay us something, and if income is high, they don't have to pay. And there's a premium that we pay every year, and so on. So, I mean, I think there are market-like solutions for all of those things, right? But then the question to me is, well would those markets actually function, right? And so when I think about the risk thing, for example, I mean, I think there are good reasons why unemployment insurance is typically done in the public sector. It's not done in the private sector. And the reason is you've got these moral hazard and adverse selection problems where, you know, insurance companies are very reluctant to sell income insurance to either individual workers or to firms, because insurance company can't, you know, they're worried about what does that do to the incentives of people to actually maintain productivity and maintain profit and so forth. So, you know, so I think there's some pretty obvious problems with dealing with the risk issue through insurance companies. Then you go back to the capital supply. I mean, I guess I'm not saying it's impossible to use these kinds of solutions. I wouldn't make that argument. But for example, I think to the extent that leasing of physical assets works, and in the sense the outside owners of the assets can easily monitor how the assets are being used. They can be on guard for, you know, depreciation issues that are depreciation that's excessive and this kind of stuff. So, I mean, if there's good monitoring of that stuff and these are kind of indestructible, yeah, that might work. And to the extent that it does work, it reduces the amount of upfront capital that a workers' cooperative would need to have in order to get up and running, because, you know, you have to buy all your assets up front. You can lease some of them, and then pay for the leasing out of cash flow. So yeah, I mean, that could work. Debt contracts can work, and they sometimes do work. Although there, I think, you know, there the issue starts to become one of collateral and how good is the collateral, right? So if I'm a lender, I'm worried that I might not get paid back. I'm worried this labor managed firm might go belly up or something. Well, then I start to ask myself, if a bad outcome happened, what do I get, right? And well, do I get sort of good collateral in the sense of, you know, land, buildings, machinery, inventories, stuff that has a good secondhand market, where I can just seize the collateral and then go off and sell it somewhere, and I'll get back some large percentage of the principal on my loan? Well, it, you know, might work well in that case. But if there isn't good collateral, if what you're borrowing for is, you know, you need to invest in some intangible assets like, you know, research or human capital of some kind, skills, whatever. Well, you know, in practice, if the firm fails, there's not going to be a lot of collateral that the bank could get. And more reluctant to make those start to become more serious. And you know, for the outside investors who are supplying equity and expecting to get dividends, but they don't have voting rights, I'm actually quite skeptical on that. I don't think we observe that very often, if ever. And I think there's a very good reason we don't observe it, which is that, you know, if you're being promised dividends, but you have no control over what the level of those dividends is going to be and when they're to get paid, and they may never get paid, you're going to be a little skeptical about putting a lot of capital in up front. So I think there are reasons why that's a quite rare solution to this problem. But I mean, I don't disagree with you. I mean, I think there's a spectrum of things here, and some of these things, you don't have big informational problems, you don't have big credible commitment problems, it might work. Other things, I think it's a little more dicey, a little sketchier.
Yeah, thanks.
So I got Roberto next on the list.
Hi, thanks, Greg, for your presentation. There's one argument which wasn't in it, and I wonder whether you would have something to say about it, which is if we try to take into account the historical perspective of how the let's say Western capitalism has been evolving in the last 70, let's say, from the high tide of worker cooperatives in the maybe 50, 60, and 70, and today, I was wondering whether the major macroeconomic shifts towards globalization or shortened economic cycles, the importance of knowledge, etc., are creating conditions which are more or less favorable for worker cooperatives, or whether it's simply not relevant. Because one interesting argument could be to say, or to ask whether, given the evolution of Western capitalism in the last 50 years, conditions have been increasingly more difficult for workers' cooperative, given the basic feature you were defining at the beginning, namely the fact that human capital cannot be sold, and so you have this difference between labor and capital intensive, in the sense in which a capital intensive company can easily buy competencies, whereas or take them out, whereas cooperative, this is the most difficult thing. So I mean, maybe you have some ideas about how the historical dimension can put into your framework.
Yeah, no, those are great questions, and I'm not sure I've got completely convincing answers, but let me try. So there's been some work done on how the formation and failure of LMFs correlated with the business cycle. Okay, so there's been some really interesting work done on this in France, and my recollection of what that literature says is that you tend to get higher formation rates of labor managed firms. Let's just say workers' cooperatives, higher formation rates for worker cooperatives in recessions than in booms, which is interesting, right? So what that suggests to me is when the external labor market is bad, right? So you get, unemployment rates of 8%, 10%, something like that. People are going to have, expect really long search periods to find a new job. Maybe the new job they get isn't going to pay as much as what they're accustomed to. And, so macro conditions are bad. That seems to be incentivizing in terms of people trying to set up sort of unconventional alternative ways of getting employment, like workers' cooperatives. So we've got a little bit of evidence on that. So, I mean, it depends what you think the future holds, but if you think the future holds lots of recessions, then, maybe we're going to get some waves of LMF formation in response to that. Yeah, more generally in terms of what's going on at the shop floor level within capitalist firms, my general sense is that LMFs are more likely to look like an attractive alternative if there's lots of conflict going on between and workers in conventional firms. And so I think about this. This is getting a little abstract again, but economists tend to do that. So suppose I'm thinking, all right, there's a credible commitment problem with LMFs in terms of the promises they want to make to investors in terms of getting some capital, right? There's a symmetric problem that capitalist firms face, which is making credible commitments to workers or employees about things like working conditions, things like promotions, things like wage growth in the future, all of these kinds of things, right? Where, there's an intertemporal sort of relationship between firm and employees. And so one of my questions at a sort of abstract level would be, why do we think the credible commitment problem that LMFs face in relation to capital suppliers is any worse, better or worse than the credible commitment problem that capitalist firms face in relation to the labor market, right? In relation to labor suppliers? And, there are some answers to that, which I don't want to go into, but I think to the extent that things kind of become worse in capitalist firms in terms of shop floor conflict, that's kind of symptomatic of these credible commitment problems are becoming more severe within capitalist firms. Well, if that's the case, then, other things being equal, workers' cooperatives start to look more attractive because they don't have these internal conflictual relationships between capital and labor. Now, they do have problems of how to get capital, but that's just kind of different thing. I don't know if that answers your question at all, but those are some thoughts off the top of my head.
So, are there any other questions right now, which I might have missed? If not, I would just jump in here and pose a question to Greg. You mentioned this imperfections in worker knowledge, kind of an obstacle for LMFs. And I was wondering, what about kind of the entrepreneurial culture that we have currently? Like when people think about starting a firm, like most people think of LMFs, right? So also like how business schools teach entrepreneurship or the knowledge of different legal forms, how to run a firm. Do you think that is a problem too for the birth rate of LMFs?
Yeah, I do. And I think we need to think pretty carefully about some notion of collective entrepreneurship, right? I mean, we tend to think about entrepreneurship as this kind of individual thing where, you know, Steve Jobs has a bright idea and he goes off and invents a product or something. But, you know, I mean, the problem with that model, you know, for the reasons that I was discussing earlier, so a question about why don't wealthy entrepreneurs with good projects create labor managed firms, right? I mean, if they understand the productivity issues, understand that labor managed firms at least sometimes are going to have higher productivity than KMFs, right? If they get that, right, and they know they've got a good idea and they know they've got enough money that they're not wealth constrained, why don't they just set up LMFs? And the answer to that question, I think, has to be they perceive some obstacle in sort of getting rents out of the firm, right? Extracting the value of this entrepreneurial idea from the firm. Because if you're going to set up an LMF, well, you're not going to get much just by being one member out of 200 members, right? That's not going to work as a rent extraction method. What you could try to do is sell membership positions to workers, right? So you could try to say, let's set up a workers co-op, and I'm the one with the great idea. I'm going to charge each of you, you know, $1,000 to join my workers co-op. But once you're in the co-op, you have the idea, you can exploit that technology, that product, whatever it is, off you go. And I got my money out up front through the membership fees, so I'm happy. And you guys get to have a productive life. I think the problem with that is workers have a really hard time being sure with those kinds of upfront transactions, upfront membership fees, that they're actually getting something that's worth the money they would be putting in. And you know, I mean, we all know some entrepreneurs have great ideas, some entrepreneurs have terrible ideas, some entrepreneurs are kind of fly-by-night people. They're just scam artists who will take your money and leave the country or something. You know, so workers have to be aware of that. And even I think this is separate from the capital constraint issue, the capital supply issue. Even imagine that workers who are wealthy enough that they don't have to worry about paying membership fees, right? And they're risk neutral, so they're not worried about, you know, portfolio diversity and stuff. So take those things out of the equation, right? It could still be true that workers don't want to pay much to join labor managed firms because they can't be confident about, you know, the long run value of the firm that they're becoming a member of. And I don't think there's been enough thought about that. I mean, either among economists or perhaps other people too. So how do you get around that problem? And one of the big advantages that I see to something like Mondragon or like the Lega is you have these federations where the entrepreneurship becomes collective, right? Where you're not dealing just with one guy like Steve Jobs, right? Who might be lying to you or might be scamming you, right? You've got this entire federation that's set up in a way that creates new labor managed firms and in ways that kind of break down these informational asymmetries and sort of make promises that are credible to the workers who are joining a new LMF or workers who are buying out an existing LMF, that there's some source of collective entrepreneurship and financing and risk bearing that looks credible in the eyes of workers. And I think we could probably increase the birth rate of LMFs a lot if we had more systematic institutional structures of that kind.
Yeah, thanks. So Pedro is next, if I'm correct. I don't miss anybody.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Sorry, just a second. All of a sudden I have a few questions, and I think maybe I guess the first question I have links to somehow to what mentioned in the beginning, perhaps, and maybe Gregory, and thank you for your presentation. Maybe you could say a little more about the analytical distinction that you use from the beginning, from the get-go of your article or presentation, so between labor managed firms and capital managed firms. And I take, of course, then capital managed firms to be firms in which the decisions about management and the internal operations of the firm are made by the owners of capital. This already, I think, maybe raises a few questions when it comes to modern large corporations, which use, of course, the figure of middle management or the CEO, which sometimes has sort of complicated, intertwined connection with capital owners. But that being sort of, I didn't want to stress that much. But I was wondering whether it would make sense, or put it in a different way, whether you considered already, maybe instead of having a dual distinction, so you have labor managed firms and capital managed firms, whether you have makes sense, for example, to have something like three groups in which you have labor managed firms in which there is an external source of capital, and you have capital managed firms, and you have, let's put it like this, labor capital managed firms, in the sense that, for example, and this applies particularly also not only to workers' cooperatives, but to small business units that are very typical in, say, Southern Europe. When you are a small business owner, you typically the capital, the initial capital is yours, but you're also the laborer that operates the small store or the small business, right? You have, and in that sense, you're both. It's both run by capital and both run and by labor. And I wonder whether this would just, I guess, probably drop this possibility just because it makes the model too complicated from the analytical point of view, yeah. I suppose. Yeah, I have more questions, but maybe.
Okay, no, I mean, good point. And yeah, no, you're absolutely right. When I think about, restaurants or, small mom and pop convenience stores, grocery stores, I mean, people are clearly, investing their as well as their time in these kinds of firms. So you're exactly right. I mean, there's not going to be any sharp distinction there between firms controlled by capital suppliers or labor suppliers. It's a meaningless distinction in that context. I think you really have to get to firms of a sufficient size that they've got a formal control structure of some sort, right? And so once you get to firms that have, several hundred people working in them, or certainly thousands, you're almost always going to have some set of formal rules that specify how managers are chosen, who has the right to hire and fire managers, and things like this. So, I think usually it's fairly simple once you're talking about large firms to figure out, are you dealing with an LMF or a KMF? And because, just basically look at voting rights. If voting rights are associated with how much capital people supply, it's a KMF, right? If voting rights are attached mostly to the amount of labor people supply, which is often equal, right? It's going to be an LMF. So you can use that kind of a fairly simple demarcation rule, I think. But you get into trouble even there, right? Because you can have, hybrid forms of organization, right? So you can have co-determination. We've got some employee representatives sitting on the board of directors who have some role at least in monitoring the management. You could have employee stock ownership plans, very common in the US, where employees may have 20%, 30%, maybe even more than 50% in some cases of the equity shares of the firm. So the employees as a group are supplying substantial capital to the firm. But also, of course, substantial labor. So is that a KMF or an LMF? And so there I'd go back to what are the voting rights based on, right? I mean, if the voting rights are based on 1 vote per share of equity capital, I'll call it a capitalist firm, right? But if it's based on 1 vote per worker, which is not common, but it's theoretically possible, within the employee stock ownership plan legislation, right? I mean, you could legally, you could construct a firm that is an ESOP, but you structure it in such a way that it's one employee, one vote. Well, then I would call that a labor managed firm, right? So, you know, it's tricky. It gets tricky in some cases. Definitely agree. I don't know. Did that, you had another question, I think?
Yeah, I have a couple of other, but there's someone else now on the list, so I think I should wait and
Okay.
yeah.
Yeah, I think Denise, I'm not sure how to pronounce your name, sorry.
No problem, thank you. Thank you for organizing this. I jumped in, I saw in the newsletter, and that was really, really interesting. And I love the work by Gregory Dahl. I really appreciate all of his work. And I had a question about the rate of LMF. What do you think about the role of mimicry? The simple fact that usually firms are managed by capital instead of labor, and it's like common, creates a sort of social inertia, and people do not really think about when they create a firm, are we going to do a capital managed firm or a labor managed firm? It's just that they follow and imitate the prevailing organizational form without giving much thought to it. So it's like I'm thinking about the concept of emulation by Charles Tilly. He wrote about that not with regard to workplace democracy, but generally about organizational forms. So more simply, besides all the other, you know, concerns about productivity, costs, risks, there is more simply the fact that people do not think about it and they follow the inertia of the prevailing organizational form. What do you think about that?
I agree with that. I think that's exactly right. And, you know, I think historically, if you look at sort of the history of labor managed firm formation, you find a lot of clustering, right? So this is particularly true in the US. I imagine it might be true in Europe as well, where you see historical episodes where groups of worker cooperatives kind of spring up in certain industries, in certain time periods, certain geographic areas, and you know, they last for maybe a few decades or more, gradually disappear as technology changes and markets change and so forth. But I think that's exactly the kind of phenomenon you're talking about, where, you know, if somebody, for some group of people, for some random set of reasons, happens to stumble upon this kind of organizational form and it proves to be successful, then other people who know about it will start to copy it. And this was definitely happening with the plywood cooperatives in the US Northwest, where in around 1920, you had the first one created, turned out to be very successful. The people involved, the members involved had shares that actually could be bought and sold on markets, and these shares became very valuable. So people started creating more of these firms, right? And so you start to see in the 40s and the 50s, you get quite a bit of entry from new labor managed firms, and then for reasons that we don't need to go into, that finally stopped. But no, so I think you're right. I mean, so what explains this clustering thing? I mean, some of it I think is sort of learning and imitation, right? LMFs are an unconventional, kind of rare form of organization, but you know, when it becomes obvious that there are examples, there are templates, right, that successful, people tend to imitate that to some degree. You know, but I think for other factors, there's kind of flows of expertise and other kinds of resources from one LMF to another if they're kind of located in the same industry in the same region. So the sort of mutual support that goes on among some of these firms. In some cases, I think it's maybe not causal in the same way, but it's you've got a region in an industry that's, you know, hit by a common economic shock of some kind simultaneously, and it appears to a whole lot of people at the same time that, oh, maybe employee buyouts of capitalist firms solve our problem, or that kind of thing. So, I think there's a range of things going on, but I do find it really interesting that there are these positive agglomeration effects, right? That once you get a population of these firms, it becomes, on the margin easier to create the next one. And that process has some natural stopping points. Typically, it doesn't go on forever. But I think the phenomenon you're pointing to is an interesting phenomenon.
So Pedro, I think there's nobody else right now, so you could maybe repeat your second question if you want to.
Great. Now I have a second question and a third if I have time. So I was now thinking a little bit about what Gregory you mentioned in your presentation, this empirical set of empirical evidence related to or about productivity levels, right? And you mentioned, I hope I'm being accurate here, that well, within the same industry, and I stress this, within the same industry, LMFs seem to be at least more productive, right? But then a second notion or a second piece of evidence you mentioned there that we can, I guess, combine with this is that at the same time, LMFs seem to be more, or we find more frequently LMFs within certain industries than in others. And so, for example, capital intensive industries tend to have fewer LMFs, right? Now, this makes me wonder whether, and it's also a question about the existing literature and evidence about this, which I don't know as you do. So I was wondering about whether what we're talking about here is a kind of like intra-industry productivity comparison, whereas maybe we have to talk about inter-industry productivity comparisons in the sense that might account for why people then in certain, at least, well, not if not always in the business cycle, but in certain moments of the business cycle, would rather be formally employed in an industry that has higher productivity vis-a-vis another type of industry, and that in an industry, therefore, that displays higher frequency of KMFs, instead of maybe moving to the lower productivity sector, right? Now, this would maybe account for the fact that KMFs are more representative or have a much larger weight in the economy, and still be connected to a question of productivity. It would be a comparison between industries. And I guess another way, maybe in a different metric, to account for this, instead of talking about productivity, I was wondering whether we should talk about high added value or low added value industries, right? So for example, you think about tourism, it's typically a relatively low added value industry, whereas say talk about pharmaceutical or auto industry and so on, or I don't know, computer, these are more like high added value industries where the margins are much larger, and therefore I guess you can make eventually a link to productivity. So I wonder if this is also discussed in the literature, or whether maybe you think this is, I guess, meaningless, or it can be also a little bit deceiving somehow.
Well, no, I think you're raising good points. So let me go at it this way. Among economists, people who are skeptical about labor managed firms, right, who more skeptical than I am, would probably say, okay, we admit that sort of reasonable empirical evidence that in firms where KMFs and LMFs both exist, the LMFs do pretty well, or they do well enough to survive over long periods of time, right? So they're not driven out of the market by their capitalist rivals. But, that's some subset of industries, right? And in all the other industries where we don't see LMFs, it must be because they would have productivity problems in those industries, right? So they don't appear there because they wouldn't be very good. They're not a good fit with those markets, right? So we don't see them. The reason why I'm not as skeptical as that, right, or as pessimistic as that, is I do think there are some important market failures out there and important entry barriers to LMFs in certain industries. And so I would say, look, conditional on getting an LMF to exist in some industry, it might do well. But there are entry barriers that are systematically preventing LMFs from getting into certain industries. And so therefore we don't observe them there, but there could be policy things. There might be public policy things we could do to reduce the height of those entry barriers. And then if we could do that, then sort of the LMF productivity advantage kicks in and the survival advantage kicks in, and they'll be fine once we get them going, right? So that's a little bit closer to the way I feel about this. And so then to me, it becomes a matter focusing on the productivity issues, but focusing more on what are these entry barriers or conversion barriers, right? And what could we do about that, that in a way that makes some economic sense from a policy point of view. So that's kind of my perspective on that. But I do think we need a lot more research on, to the extent that LMFs do seem to sometimes have productivity advantages, right? And they don't always, right? I mean, anybody who does this research finds industries where both types of firms exist. There's no statistically significant difference between them in terms of productivity, and that's that, right? So, so it's only going to be a subset where the LMFs clearly have some advantage. But I think we need a lot more research on the sources of those advantages. I mean, at a sort of deeper level, right? And economists have ideas about this. Like LMFs may be good in terms of work incentives. They might be good in terms of how information flows within a firm. They might be providing more job security, which then encourages people to make investments in human capital, training, things like this. And maybe in the long run, that provides some innovation that's helpful to the firm. So but there's a bunch of causal pathways at the level of the firm where we need to be thinking about, okay, if we really believe that sometimes at least there are these productivity advantages, what's driving them? Where are they coming from? And that's going to help us identify what are the industries that we think might be promising in the future for LMF entry, right? If the industries have those characteristics, then that suggests that that's something to target, right? So, I mean, I'd be thinking about that entire range of things.
So I got Philip next on the list, and after that, Hannes, if you still want to jump in, you can.
Yeah, thank you so much, Alexander, for putting together the talk again. And Greg, it's really to see you in person or in virtually here. Your work has been really central to my development and interest in the field. And it's a really terrific talk. And just to kind of, continue, I guess, the line of questioning has been repeated a couple different times here regarding either birth of LMFs or conversion. Well, we have this huge, the silver tsunami, right? I mean, this is the opportunity for conversion, at least, with 80% of business worker or business owners in the US at least that will be reaching a retirement age or wanting to retire and potentially sell their businesses or convert their businesses or something within the next 5 to 10 years. So I'm curious if you believe we are institutionally in a place to take advantage of this turnover conversions that we could potentially observe, and if not, what would need to be put in place to kind of take advantage of this moment historically?
Yeah, okay, great question. I think I can give a somewhat better answer for the US than I can for Europe, and I'd be interested to hear what other people think about that. So in the US, there's one fairly obvious institutional mechanism for handling this, which is employee stock ownership plans, right? And so you can get founding entrepreneurs who are getting into their 60s, 70s, 80s. Maybe they don't happen to have any kids that want to step in. Maybe for whatever reason, they don't want to take the company public and put it on a stock exchange. So, what can they do? Well, they've got maybe a loyal workforce that they feel some, emotional bonds for or something of this kind. And they say, I want a market for my shares. I want to cash out and retire. I've got a group of loyal employees who might actually be able to pay me something in return for those shares. So let's set up an employee stock ownership plan. I'll transfer my shares over to the ESOP. The workers kick in something, maybe I kick in something, but the net result is to sort of cash out the entrepreneur. And you can legally structure an ESOP in the US so that the resulting firm is one worker, one vote. I mean, it is possible to do that. Now, whether retiring entrepreneurs are motivated to do that, whether they care about that, whether they've ever even thought about it, I don't know. But there's institutional vehicle that could be used for that purpose. It doesn't have to be that the voting rights are based on the value of share and employees and that kind of thing. So there's an institutional mechanism. I am not enough of a data guy to be able to tell you empirically how often that's happening in the US, or whether it's been happening more often with the aging of baby boomer entrepreneur founders of firms. That's an interesting question. It'd be interesting to look at some numbers on that. Whether there are similar institutional mechanisms in Europe, I'm happy to just kind of toss that out to the group. And if anybody's got any thoughts on it, I'd like to know.
So, I mean, if somebody wants to jump in on the question, maybe I would postpone Hannes' question now, but if not, I would give the word to Hannes. So if there's an expert on the European side here. Okay, Hannes, I think maybe you can answer it. I don't know.
I'm still thinking about your basic qualitative difference that you draw between capital and labor, being that labor is inalienable and capital is alienable. And I think that's very convincing, of course, at first sight. But it made me think a lot about what follows from this, because you might think it follows that this basic distinction actually justifies in some way the predominance of KMFs. Mm-hmm. Because if you have this basic asymmetry between capital and labor, and if you have the additional assumption that kind of flexibility in financing, getting capital for your firm is economically very important, but also like socially very useful. It's very important that like firm founders, entrepreneurs who have good ideas get capital, get money for their business, so that it's able to grow. That's important, of course, from a social point of view, but also from an economic point of view. So the conclusion might be at this point that actually it's a good thing that there are so much KMFs out there. And also if you have this additional argument that you also brought up, that if you supply capital to a firm, there are good reasons economically, but also normatively, that you want to have control rights over that firm. You don't want to give away, you just give away your money without having control over what is being done with your money. So if you add these things together, it might seem to me that you could reach the conclusion, well, it's good to have flexibility in the capital market. You have this basic asymmetry between capital and labor. So maybe we really have good reasons for having KMFs. And so this kind of asymmetry on the empirical side, that there are so few LMFs, is kind of, it's not unfair. It makes sense economically, but it's also kind of justified from a broader point of view. That might be, for me, one conclusion that you could reach when you really look into this distinction between capital being alienable, labor being inalienable.
Okay, let me.
It's kind of a devil's advocate question.
No, it's a great question, and I've wrestled with this myself. So my own view would be that this alienability distinction is kind of immutable, right? I mean, there's not a whole lot we can do about that policy point of view, right? It's hard for me to imagine policy interventions that sort of operate on that issue. Okay, so let's say we take that as given. Now, do we then say, well, there's really nothing much we can do or should do in terms of changing the relative populations of LMFs and KMFs, right? Because we're stuck with that. I think that the answer to that question turns on the issue of market imperfections, right? So remember I said toward the beginning that if you had a world of complete and perfectly competitive markets, you wouldn't see any asymmetry between these kinds of firms, right? So I would argue that pretty strongly, that if in abstract competitive markets type of world, you would have roughly the same numbers of KMFs and LMFs. They'd be randomly distributed across industries. They'd all maximize profit, and kind of end of discussion. So my point there in sort of throwing that out, that hypothetical out there, is to say, well, look, so we know in the real world there are lots of asymmetries, right? And the big asymmetry is the relative abundance or scarcity kinds of firms, right? That capital managed firms are clearly more, particularly at large scales, right? But there are all these other asymmetries I kind of alluded to in terms of how firms respond to economic shocks and how they're distributed across industries and all that stuff. So there's got to be some market imperfections in your theory in order to account for those observations, right? I mean, we're not going to be able to do it any other way. But so if there have to be some market imperfections in the theory as part of the explanation for what we observe, then the question becomes, from a policy point of view, can we do anything that acts upon those market imperfections, right? And even though we take as given, we take for granted, yes, we've got this alienability difference, but nevertheless, are there market imperfections like, problems, like credible commitment problems, like externalities, et cetera, where policy could play a role, and maybe it could kind of tilt us a little bit more in the direction of a larger population of labor managed firms. So that's kind of where my thinking is at on that. I mean, think about it this way: governments routinely intervene in economies in order to fix market imperfections, right? There's nothing controversial or unusual about that, right? So economists talk all the time about, what should governments do about externalities, public goods, and information problems. And so we have those conversations constantly. And so if I can then make a case to my fellow economists that, yeah, there's the alienability thing, that's part of the story, but there's also a bunch of market imperfections, and that's another part of the story, then I've got some hope of persuading my economist friends, maybe there's some policy interventions that deal with the market imperfection side of that in ways that might be helpful, in ways that advocates of LMFs might find beneficial, attractive. So that's the range of things that I'm wrestling with on that.
Hannes, you look like you got a follow-up question, but
it's I'm kind of So I mean, I'm like, imagine I'm this biotech entrepreneur founder. I have this super idea which would be super helpful for society, but I need lots of money, lots of capital. I go to the capital market and go get me some venture capitalists who give me the money. So you would say the market imperfections that kick in are these problems of information and credibility and so forth.
Yes, largely those two things.
Yeah.
So
I'm thinking is these information are these market imperfections? Yeah. Are there some? No, I don't. Yeah. It's okay. I'm just still thinking.
No, I mean, I would just say, here's sort of like a really simplistic way to think about it. Suppose that you're an entrepreneur and you've got a great idea, be good for society, maybe make people a lot of money. If you're wealthy, you have to think about going to the capital market, right? You've already got the capital. and you already know the value of your project, or at least you know more about it than other people do. So you don't have any of these capital market imperfections to deal with. Right? You don't have to worry about the adverse selection, moral hazard, and so on. On the other hand, if I've got a great entrepreneurial idea and I want to create a labor managed firm, right? What do? Well, I've got to get some capital. If I don't have capital, I've got to get some. But now I do have to go to the capital market, right? And now I have to I do have to deal with all of these informational problems and commitment problems and so on. So there's an asymmetry here where, you know, if you've already got capital and you're an entrepreneur, then yeah, you got to go to the labor market, and there may be some frictions in the labor market, but you're not going to have to deal with frictions in the capital market, right? On the other hand, if you're an entrepreneur who's short of capital and you'd like to set up a labor managed firm, you do have to deal with all of those capital market frictions. So, you know.
Okay. If there are there any further questions? I mean, there's still a bit of time if we want to go on. It's once in a lifetime opportunity here to ask a question to Greg. But if there's no more questions coming up, okay, Pedro has one.
And this, I promise, my final question. I now wanted to ask you something about the policy prescriptions you mentioned towards the end. You mentioned two levels, right? So facilitating the conversion of KMFs into LMFs, right? And I guess most of these measures would be within the legal framework somehow, right? Or at least from the beginning, I guess, like facilitating these. And then you mentioned on second level, which had to do with the formation of federations of
right.
LMFs, like inspired by the Montberger and so on. And I was wondering whether either within these two levels, or as a, maybe you, I don't know if you are thinking about this idea in mind as a sub element of these or an independent one, but would a kind of a reform of the financial system in a direction that would make these kinds of firms, LMFs, more productive by changing the determinants of, so the architecture of financial system, of capital markets, and by changing thereby the determinants of productivity. Would this also be a level, or would it be inserted into somehow these two major levels or policy prescriptions?
I think there could be a number of institutional innovations that would be helpful. So sort of putting aside the solution, right, and just thinking about things like conversions or creating individual firms from scratch. You know, I mean, kind of going back to the financing thing again, I mean, something like, you know, bond financing of LMFs, I think makes some sense, right? So I mean, one thing you can do is go to the bank and get a loan, but another thing you might be able to do is sell bonds. And, you know, bondholders don't expect that they're going to have any day-to-day participation in managing the firm. I mean, you know, if there's some, you know, unusual crisis, the bondholders may get some rights, but other than that, they kind of get they're promised this predictable return. And yeah, I mean, if you could create kind of an institutional infrastructure where it's relatively easy for LMFs to go to a sort of specialty bond market, right, where people are looking for those kinds of financial instruments, and perhaps with some you know, regulation by some government agencies to kind of reassure the buyers of these bonds that these firms will actually pay in the end. You know, I mean, we have lots of regulatory agencies for stock markets, right? Stock exchanges. I don't see any reason why we couldn't have regulatory agencies for LMF bond markets. But you kind of need a critical mass, right? You've got to have, you know, enough firms that are selling enough bonds that, you know, this is a liquid asset and people know they can turn it into cash if they need the cash. And so, you know, I could imagine a bunch of institutional innovation along those lines that might be pretty helpful. But maybe we're not getting there because we don't have the critical mass of LMFs to make that kind of institution worthwhile.
Okay, so give one last opportunity for questions for Greg, and if there's no more questions, I would close the Q&A session now. And thank you very much, Greg, for being patient with our questions and getting up so early and taking the time today. It was a great talk.
Well, it was great for me too. And I just want to thank everybody for the questions. I mean, I think that the questions were right on target, excellent questions. These are all things we ought to be thinking about. And I'm really happy to, see everybody and see that there's so much interest in this stuff. That makes me feel good. So thank you, everyone.